Well, hello everyone. Last week we had an introduction to the Gospel of Mark. This week we're going to dig into chapters 2 and 3. But just a general overview, the Gospel of Mark is broken into two halves, essentially. The first half of the Gospel of Mark relates a bunch of stories that raise the question of who exactly is this Jesus guy. And then in the second half, it starts to be unveiled who Jesus is. So first half, who is Jesus? Second half, the mystery starts to be unveiled. In chapters 2 and 3, we get a collection of stories about Jesus that are both miracle stories and also controversies with the Pharisees. We don't see a whole lot of Jesus' teaching. As we go throughout the second and third chapters of Mark, it's clear Jesus is gathering with people and he's speaking to them, but we don't get samples of his preaching. What we hear is stories about what he's done and then the arguments that he has with the Pharisees. So what are we to make of all these arguments that Jesus has with the Pharisees? Let's start with who the Pharisees were. The Pharisees were a sort of lay religious movement during New Testament times. Lay because they weren't connected with the temple priesthood and the high priest and the sacrifice that went on in the temple. They were connected with the synagogue system. There were synagogues throughout Judea and throughout Galilee. And the Pharisees provided an answer to the question, how do I live my life as a good Jewish person if I'm not in Jerusalem, so I can't be part of temple worship and temple sacrifice day in and day out? What is it I do? So it would be wrong to characterize the Pharisees as villains throughout the Gospels. They had a lot going for them. And actually, Jesus had a lot in common with the Pharisees. Like the Pharisees, he taught a life of personal virtue, of prayerfulness, of piety. And like the Pharisees, Jesus taught that in the end times there would be a resurrection of the dead. We think that a lot of the early Christians who had Jewish background probably were among those who were taught by the Pharisees how to live a good Jewish life. Historians will read a lot of interesting things in these passages about the development of Christianity and Judaism in different directions in the early decades. But I think for our purposes today, one of the things we want to get out of Jesus' controversy with the Pharisees is that something new is happening. Part of the mystery of who Jesus is that he comes and he seems to be in line with them in some ways, and yet teaching goes off in a different direction, which raises the question again and again, who is this guy? And he tells them, you don't put new wine into old wineskins. You don't sew a new patch on an old cloak, because it's all going to fall apart. There's something new happening. So in this early part of the Gospel of Mark, as we get this growing question of who exactly is Jesus, part of the growth of that question is his conflicts with a religious group that in some ways it seems like he would be allied with. And of course, we also start to see Jesus pushing back against the notion that growing in communion with God is primarily a matter of following a list of rules, precisely, especially when some of the rules are more like interpretations of commentaries on Mosaic law rather than the words of the scriptures themselves. Another thing to notice, we have stories about the call of the apostles. We have a special call story about a man named Levi, who was a tax collector. Now, if you read Mark's list of the 12 apostles, you won't see Levi's name. We've tended to identify Levi in Matthew. Maybe he had two different names, because we know from the Gospel of Matthew that Matthew was a tax collector, and the story of Matthew's call in the Gospel of Matthew is almost identical to the story of Levi's call. So we think they're the same person. Final story in Mark chapter 3 is where some of Jesus' family arrive. And he says, who is my mother and my brothers? Then he looks around at all the people who are with him. And he says, everyone who does the will of God is my brother and my mother and my sister. It's this odd passage. You can certainly read a lot of commentaries that give different interpretations. But something I'd suggest to you is this. Like we said, the first half of the Gospel of Mark is all about raising this question of who is this fascinating Jesus character. And I think that this passage is part of that. Who is this guy who talks about his followers, his friends, the people who are gathering around him, talks about them as though they have a relationship that is at least as deep as blood ties. So that's Mark chapters 2 and 3. I'd encourage you to read those 2 chapters a couple times during the week, preferably in a Bible that has some good footnotes. And next week we'll move on to chapters 4 and 5. Have a good week, and I'll see you around the Newman Center.